Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman telling a story like this out loud, but sometimes the only way to make sense of what broke you is to speak it slowly, honestly, from the very beginning. The day my ex-husband came back into my life, it was raining in that quiet, apologetic way rain does when it doesn't want to be noticed, the kind that darkens the sidewalks but never makes a sound. I remember because I was standing at the kitchen sink, staring out the window, thinking about nothing at all, when the doorbell rang. Not a knock, a doorbell. As if whoever stood on the other side still believed they belonged here. When I opened the door and saw him, I didn't gasp or step back like they do in movies. I just felt tired, bone-tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He looked older than I remembered, thinner through the face, his hairline retreating just enough to make the years undeniable. His coat was damp at the shoulders, his eyes nervous, hopeful, and already apologetic before he even spoke my name. He said my name the way he used to when he needed forgiveness before he'd earned it. Soft, careful, like he was testing whether it still belonged to him. I should have closed the door. I should have said, "This isn't a good time," or "You should leave." But after 12 years of marriage and one messy, quiet divorce, part of me still felt responsible for his comfort. That part hadn't died yet. So I stepped aside and let him in. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and old coffee. It was the same house we'd once shared, though he hadn't set foot in it for almost 3 years. He stood in the entryway like a guest afraid to touch anything, clutching his coat, glancing around as if expecting the walls to accuse him. "I didn't know if you'd answer," he said. "I didn't know it was you. That was the truth. If I'd known, I might not have." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd signed school permission slips, argued over bills, planned vacations that never quite happened. The rain tapped softly against the window while he talked, or tried to. His words came out tangled, rehearsed, as if he'd practiced them in the car and lost the script halfway through. He told me he was sorry, not just sorry, but deeply, painfully sorry, for the distance, for the lies, for making me feel invisible while I was still standing right next to him. He said he'd gone to therapy, said he finally understood what he'd done to our family, said losing me had been the biggest mistake of his life. I listened without interrupting, my hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. I'd imagined this conversation once, maybe twice, in the early months after the divorce, when the wound was still open and bleeding. Back then, I'd wanted him to come back on his knees. I'd wanted tears, regret, proof that I mattered. But now, sitting across from him, all I felt was a strange, distant sadness, like watching someone cry over a house that had already burned down. He cried too, real tears. They slid down his face and dripped off his chin, and for a brief, dangerous moment, I almost believed him. He told me he'd never stopped loving me, that everything else had been a distraction, a mistake, a life he'd been trying to escape. He said he wanted to make things right, not rush me, just start with coffee, conversations, time. When he reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, I didn't pull away. I didn't squeeze back either. I just let it sit there, heavy and familiar, like an old habit I wasn't sure how to break. Eventually, he stood to leave. The rain had slowed, and the house felt too quiet again. As he shrugged out of his coat, I did what I'd done 1,000 times before without thinking. I reached for it, intending to hang it by the door. That's when I felt something hard in the pocket. "Wait," I said, more curious than alarmed. I slid my hand inside the damp fabric and pulled out a small velvet box.
dark blue, worn at the edges. The room changed in an instant. The air went tight. My heart didn't race, it dropped. He froze. For a second, neither of us spoke. The rain outside stopped completely, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "That's not—" he began, then stopped. His face drained of color. He didn't try to take it from me. I opened the box slowly, already knowing what I'd find. Inside was a ring, elegant, delicate, not my style, too small to be something old, too new to be sentimental. Another ring, not mine. I looked up at him, and in that moment, everything he'd said over the past hour collapsed under its own weight. The apology, the tears, the promises, all of it suddenly felt staged, like a performance I hadn't agreed to attend. "Who is she?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. That told me everything. He tried to explain. Of course he did. He said it wasn't what it looked like, said he'd been meaning to return it, said things were complicated, said he was confused. I stopped listening halfway through. The words blurred together into noise because the truth was already clear. He hadn't come back to apologize. He'd come back to unburden himself, to ease his guilt, to keep one door open while preparing to close another. I placed the ring back in the box and set it on the table between us. It looked so small there, yet it took up all the space in the room. "Take it," I said quietly. He reached for it, his hands shaking, and for the first time since he arrived, I felt something solid rise up inside me. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. When he left, he didn't ask for coffee next time. He didn't ask to call. He just nodded, defeated, and stepped back into the damp afternoon. I closed the door and leaned against it, my eyes finally burning with tears I refused to let fall until I was alone. That night, I sat at the same kitchen table long after the house had gone dark, staring at the place where the ring had rested. I realized something then, something painful but freeing. Closure doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it comes with evidence. And sometimes the person who broke you comes back not to heal you, but to see if the door is still unlocked. I made sure it wasn't.
The days after he left felt strangely quiet. Not in the peaceful way people promise you healing will feel, but in the hollow way a house sounds after furniture has been moved out. Every creak startled me. Every memory echoed louder than it should have. I kept replaying the moment I pulled that velvet box from his pocket, the way his face collapsed, the way the truth arrived without raising its voice. I didn't cry right away. That came later, in pieces, at inconvenient times, like while folding laundry or waiting at a red light. For years after our divorce, I had blamed myself more than I ever admitted out loud. I told myself if I'd been softer, prettier, less tired, more patient, he wouldn't have strayed emotionally before he ever did physically. That was how the end began, after all. Long nights at work, a phone always turned face down, a man who laughed more at his screen than he ever did at our dinner table. When I finally confronted him back then, he hadn't denied it. He just said he felt unseen, as if I hadn't been standing right in front of him, holding our life together with both hands. After the ring, something shifted. Not all at once, but enough for me to notice. The shame I'd been carrying loosened its grip, because that ring wasn't about confusion or timing or emotional wounds. It was proof of a pattern, proof that even now, years later, he still wanted two futures at once. And I finally understood that his apology wasn't the ending I'd been waiting for. It was just another chapter I no longer needed to read. A week passed, then two. I didn't hear from him, and I didn't reach out. That silence felt intentional, like a boundary drawing itself without me having to say a word. Friends noticed something was different. They said I sounded steadier, lighter. I didn't tell them everything. I just said, I think I finally believe who he is. Then, on a Thursday evening, my phone buzzed while I was cooking dinner. His name appeared on the screen. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. A few seconds later, a message came through. He said he wanted to explain that I deserved the truth, that he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. I didn't respond right away. I finished cooking. I ate slowly. I washed the dishes. When I finally picked up the phone again, I realized something quietly powerful. I wasn't afraid of what he might say. I was bored by it. And that, more than anger, told me I was moving on. Still, a part of me needed closure on my own terms, not his, so I agreed to meet him. Public place, daytime, coffee shop halfway between our old life and my new one. He arrived early, sitting at a small table by the window, his hands wrapped around a cup he hadn't touched. He looked up when he saw me, relief flashing across his face like he'd been holding his breath since the last time we spoke. He talked first, he always did. He told me about her, not her name at first, just vague details. They'd met through work. She was understanding. She didn't pressure him. She knew about me. That last part stung more than I expected, not because of jealousy, but because it meant I'd been part of his story without my consent. He admitted the ring was real. He'd planned to propose. He said he panicked, said seeing me again stirred feelings he hadn't dealt with, said he needed to be sure. That's why I came, he said, to see if there was still an us. I nodded slowly, letting his words settle. Then I spoke, calm and measured, surprising even myself. I told him the truth he hadn't asked for, that I didn't want to be anyone's maybe, that love doesn't require auditions or backup plans, that if he really changed, he wouldn't have walked into my house carrying another woman's future in his pocket. He looked wounded, like I'd said something cruel, but I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't insulted him. I just named the truth plainly, without cushioning it for his comfort. He asked if I hated him. I don't, I said honestly, but I don't trust you, and I don't want a life built on hesitation. He reached into his jacket then and pulled out the ring box again, the same one. He set it on the table between us, just like before. He hasn't given it to her, he said. I don't know if I can. I felt a strange wave of sadness then, not for myself, but for the woman I'd never met, a woman waiting for certainty from a man who kept mistaking indecision for depth. That's something you need to figure out without me, I said gently. I'm not part of this triangle. I stood to leave, and this time I didn't look back. A month later, I heard through mutual friends that he'd gone through with the engagement. They said it like it was news I should react to, like a test. I smiled and wished them well, and I meant it, in the way you wish strangers well when their choices no longer touch your life. What surprised me most wasn't that he'd moved on, but that I didn't feel replaced. I felt released. I started doing things just because I wanted to. Rearranged the living room, took a weekend trip alone, signed up for a pottery class I'd always talked myself out of because he thought it was a waste of money. Each small choice felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd misplaced over the years. One evening, as I was cleaning out a drawer, I found my old wedding ring. I'd tucked it away after the divorce and forgotten about it. I held it in my palm, remembering the woman I'd been when he slid it onto my finger, hopeful, certain, unaware of how much she would one day shrink herself to keep a marriage alive. I didn't cry. I didn't feel bitter. I felt grateful. Grateful that I hadn't taken him back out of loneliness. Grateful that the truth had revealed itself before I'd opened a wound that was finally healing. I sold the ring the next day, used the money to book a short trip, nothing extravagant, just enough to mark a beginning. Sometimes apologies are sincere,
and sometimes they're just rehearsals for forgiveness the other person hasn't earned. Love isn't proven by tears or words spoken too late. It's proven by consistency, by choosing one life instead of keeping options hidden in your pocket. Finding that other ring hurt, but it also saved me, because it reminded me that I deserve to be chosen fully, openly, without hesitation. And this time, I chose myself.
In the weeks that followed, life didn't suddenly turn bright or easy the way people like to pretend it does after a moment of empowerment. Healing, I learned, isn't a clean line forward. It's a slow unwinding. Some mornings I woke up feeling steady and sure, and other mornings I woke up missing the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, even though I knew I didn't miss the man himself. I missed the version of the future I once believed in, and grieving that was quieter, lonelier, and harder to explain. There were nights I lay in bed replaying small memories I hadn't thought about in years. The way he used to tuck his cold feet under my calves in winter. The way he laughed too loudly at his own jokes. The way I used to wait up for him, even when I knew he'd be late again. Those memories didn't hurt the way they used to. They felt like photographs from someone else's life, softened around the edges, familiar but no longer sharp enough to cut me. One afternoon, my sister came over unannounced. She stood in the doorway, took one look at me, and said, "You look different. Not happier exactly, just lighter, less braced for impact." We sat on the couch drinking tea, and for the first time I told the whole story out loud, about the apology, the tears, the ring. Saying it made it real in a new way. My sister listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening in that protective way she's always had. When I finished, she said something that stayed with me. "You know what hurts the most about that ring?" she asked. "It's not that he had someone else. It's that he thought you'd be an option again." That truth landed heavily in my chest, because she was right. He hadn't come back because he respected me. He came back because he thought my love was something he could still access if he needed it. Something patient, something forgiving, something waiting. I promised myself then that I would never be someone's safety net again. Around that time, I started running into people from my past more often, at the grocery store, at the post office, people who knew us as a couple. They'd ask polite questions, glance around like they expected him to appear beside me. I learned to answer simply, "I'm doing well," I'd say. And eventually, it stopped feeling like a performance. It became true. One evening, I ran into his mother at the pharmacy. She looked surprised to see me alone, then carefully neutral. We exchanged pearlescence, the kind built on years of shared holidays and unspoken loyalty. Finally, she cleared her throat and said she'd heard her son was engaged. "I know," I replied gently. She studied my face, searching for something, anger, regret, tears. When she didn't find any, her shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for everything." That apology meant more to me than his ever could, because it wasn't asking for anything in return. It didn't come with an agenda. It was just acknowledgement. As I walked home that night, I realized something else. I'd been so focused on surviving the end of my marriage that I hadn't fully noticed how much stronger I'd become along the way. I'd paid bills alone, made decisions alone, sat with grief without letting it swallow me whole. I'd rebuilt a life piece by piece, even when I didn't believe I could. And now, standing on the other side of his apology, I saw clearly that I didn't need validation from the man who once failed me. I'd already proven everything to myself. A few months later, I got an invitation in the mail. Cream-colored envelope, elegant script, his wedding invitation. I held it in my hands longer than necessary, feeling the weight of it. Part of me wondered if this was another test,
another attempt to see if I'd react. I surprised myself by smiling. I didn't attend, but I sent a gift, nothing personal, nothing sentimental, just something useful, because bitterness would have tied me back to a story I'd already finished telling. That same weekend, I went away by myself, a small coastal town where no one knew my name or my history. I walked along the shore early in the morning, shoes in my hands, cold water lapping at my ankles. The sky was pale and wide, and for the first time in years, I felt fully present in my own body, not waiting, not hoping, just here. Standing there, I thought about the woman I'd been when I married him, how much she'd trusted love to save her, and I wished I could tell her what I know now, that love shouldn't require endurance, that apologies without change are just noise, that being chosen once doesn't mean being valued forever. Most of all, I wished I could tell her that one day a small velvet box would reveal the truth she was afraid to name, and that it would hurt, but it would also free her. When I came home from that trip, I cleared out the last box of things I'd kept just in case. Old letters, photos, a scarf that still smelled faintly like his cologne. I didn't burn anything or make a dramatic show of it. I just let it go, quietly, intentionally. Life didn't suddenly hand me a new love story after that, and I was okay with that. I learned to enjoy my own company in a way I never had before, to trust my instincts, to believe that if someone came into my life again, they'd have to come with honesty, clarity, and both feet planted firmly in one direction, because I'd already lived through the damage of being someone's almost, and I refused to ever do it again. Time has a way of softening things without asking permission. By the time summer arrived, the sharp edges of that afternoon in my kitchen had dulled, not disappeared, just smoothed enough that I could touch the memory without flinching. I noticed it one morning while watering the plants on my porch, the sun warm on my shoulders, when I realized I hadn't thought about him in days. Not deliberately, not defensively. I had simply been living. I began to understand how much of my marriage had been built around anticipation, waiting for him to come home, waiting for him to listen, waiting for him to notice when I was tired or overwhelmed or quietly unraveling. Even after the divorce, I'd been waiting in a different way, waiting for an apology that felt real, waiting for proof that what we had meant something to him after all. The ring ended that waiting. It closed a loop I didn't realize was still open. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend at the farmer's market, someone I hadn't seen since before the divorce. We hugged awkwardly, exchanged updates, and then she said something unexpected. "You seem solid," she said, smiling, "like you know who you are now." That word stayed with me. Solid. I hadn't felt solid in years. I'd felt flexible, accommodating, resilient to the point of bending too far. Solid meant rooted. It meant standing without bracing for collapse. As summer stretched on, I filled my days with small, intentional rituals, morning walks, evenings with a book instead of noise, dinners that didn't revolve around someone else's preferences. It was in those quiet routines that I started hearing my own thoughts more clearly. And sometimes those thoughts led me back to moments I'd ignored while I was married, times when my intuition whispered and I told it to be quiet, times when I accepted half answers because I was afraid of full truths. I didn't judge myself for that anymore. I understood now that survival teaches you to compromise in ways you don't recognize until later. Loving someone deeply can blur your vision. It can make you call self-erasure patience and silence peace. One evening, as I was sorting through old files, I found the paperwork from our divorce, the signatures, the dates, the finality of it all. I remembered how numb I'd felt that day, how I'd walked out of the courthouse wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Looking at those pages now, I felt something different. Gratitude, not for the pain, but for the ending, for the chance to choose differently. A few weeks later, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. It was him, or rather a message from him. Short, careful. He said he hoped I was well, said he just wanted to check in. No apology this time, no explanations, just a thread, thin and tentative, extended toward me. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I put the phone down and went back to what I was doing. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel tempted. I felt done. And that, I realized, is what real closure feels like. Not a conversation, not forgiveness spoken aloud, just the quiet certainty that you no longer owe someone access to your life. I never replied. Later that year, I volunteered at a local community center. It started as a way to fill time, but it became something grounding. I met people with stories far heavier than mine, people rebuilding after loss, illness, betrayal of all kinds. Listening to them, I recognized the same patterns I'd lived through: the self-blame, the hope that someone would come back changed, the longing for words to fix what actions had broken. Sometimes, without meaning to, I'd share a small piece of my own story. Not the drama, just the lessons. That clarity often arrives disguised as heartbreak, that the truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly in your palm, heavy and undeniable. One evening, after a long day, I came home to a letter in my mailbox, handwritten. I knew the handwriting immediately, his mother's. Inside, she wrote about the wedding, how beautiful it had been, how she hoped her son would finally learn how to be present, how to choose fully. At the end, she wrote, "Thank you for loving him when he didn't know how to love himself. I see now what that cost you." I cried then, not because I missed him, but because someone finally named the labor I'd given without acknowledgement. Sometimes being seen doesn't come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes it comes from the quiet corners you least expect. As the year turned, I made a promise to myself, not about love or relationships, but about honesty, that I would never again ignore discomfort just to keep the peace, that I would ask hard questions early, that I would trust my body when it tightened, my chest when it grew heavy, my instincts when they warned me something was off. Because that other ring wasn't the first sign, it was just the clearest one. Looking back, I don't regret letting him in that day. If I'd closed the door, I might have spent years wondering what he would have said, whether he'd really changed, whether there was still something unfinished between us. Instead, I got the truth in its simplest form, not cruel, not dramatic, just honest. And honesty, even when it hurts, is a gift. I don't know what the future holds for me. I don't need to. I know what I won't accept. I know what I bring to the table. I know that love should feel like safety, not suspense. When I think about that velvet box now, I don't feel pain. I feel clarity, because it taught me that apologies without integrity are just another form of selfishness, and that sometimes the universe puts exactly what you need into your hand, even if it breaks your heart on the way there. I didn't lose my ex-husband when he walked out of my life. I lost the illusion that loving harder could fix someone else's emptiness, and that loss made room for something far better: myself.
By the time autumn settled in, I had grown comfortable with the rhythm of my own life. The mornings were cooler, the light softer, and something inside me felt settled in a way it never had before. I wasn't waiting for messages anymore. I wasn't checking my phone with that old reflex of anticipation. My days belonged to me, fully and quietly, and I guarded that ownership with a tenderness I'd never given myself before. There were moments, of course, when the past tried to reintroduce itself. It always does. A familiar song in a grocery store aisle, a street we used to drive down on Sunday afternoons, the smell of rain on concrete, reminding me of the day he stood in my doorway asking for forgiveness he hadn't truly earned. But those moments passed like weather. They no longer rearranged my emotional landscape. They just moved through. One afternoon, I found myself sitting across from a woman at the community center, someone new to the group. She was younger than me, her eyes red-rimmed, hands clasped too tightly in her lap. She spoke about her husband with the same careful hope I once carried, explaining away his absences, his inconsistencies, the way he made promises that never quite landed. I listened, my chest aching with recognition. When she asked me how I knew it was really over with my marriage, I paused. I wanted to give her something honest, something that wouldn't rush her but wouldn't lie either. I knew, I said slowly, when the truth stopped feeling shocking and started feeling clarifying. She nodded, even though I could tell she wasn't there yet, and that was okay. We all arrive at our truths in our own time. Later that evening, I thought about how many women I knew who had been taught to interpret uncertainty as romance, struggle as loyalty, patience as virtue. I thought about how many times I told myself that love was supposed to be hard, that endurance was proof of commitment. No one ever told me that peace could be the clearest sign of love. As the holidays approached, invitations arrived. Some I accepted, others I declined without guilt. I spent Thanksgiving with my sister, laughing louder than I had in years. At Christmas, I stayed home, lit candles, cooked for myself, and watched the snow fall outside my window. There was no loneliness in it, just presence. One night, while wrapping a scarf around my neck before stepping out into the cold, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older than I used to. There were fine lines near my eyes that hadn't been there before. But there was something else, too, a steadiness, a woman who trusted herself. I realized then that the biggest shift hadn't been my relationship status, it was my relationship with doubt. I no longer negotiated with it. I didn't minimize it or explain it away. If something felt wrong, I paid attention. That awareness felt like a kind of quiet power. Early in the new year, I ran into him one last time. It was unexpected, a chance meeting at a bookstore. I was standing in line, flipping through a paperback, when I sensed someone behind me. I turned, and there he was. Older again, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. He smiled, tentative. I smiled back, polite but distant. We exchanged a few words, neutral ones. He mentioned married life. I didn't ask questions. He asked how I was doing, and I told him the truth. I'm well. There was a pause, a space where old patterns might have crept in. He looked at me as if searching for something familiar, something unfinished, but there was nothing left to offer him. No anger, no longing, no curiosity. When it was my turn at the counter, I wished him well and stepped forward. As I walked away, I didn't feel victorious, I felt complete. That night, I thought about how different the encounter would have felt if I'd never found that ring, if I'd let his apology soothe my doubts, if I'd reopened my life to a man who still didn't know how to choose. The thought made me shudder, not with fear, but with relief. Because that ring had been the truth in its simplest form, not wrapped in speeches or tears, just a small, undeniable symbol of divided intentions. I stopped seeing it as a symbol of betrayal and started seeing it as a gift. A brutal one, yes, but honest. It spared me years of confusion. It spared me the slow erosion of self from loving someone who keeps one foot out the door. Sometimes clarity doesn't come from deep conversations or dramatic confessions. Sometimes it comes from what someone carries with them when they think you aren't looking.
I don't tell this story because I'm proud of the pain I endured. I tell it because I know there's someone listening who is standing at a similar crossroads, someone being offered an apology that feels good but doesn't feel right. If that's you, I hope you listen to the quiet voice inside you, the one that tightens your chest, the one that asks questions you're afraid to answer, because that voice isn't trying to sabotage your happiness, it's trying to protect your future. My ex-husband came back with an apology, and I almost believed it. But the other ring told the truth he couldn't, and once I saw it, I could never unsee it. That was the moment I stopped hoping someone else would choose me and started choosing myself instead. And that choice changed everything.
By spring, the story of my marriage had settled into something I could carry without strain. It no longer announced itself in every quiet moment. It lived in me like a scar that had healed cleanly, visible if you looked closely, but no longer tender. I noticed the change one morning while standing in line at the bakery, listening to two women behind me complain about their partners. I felt empathy, not identification. Their words didn't hook into my ribs. They passed through me and moved on. I started to understand that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without losing your footing. Around that time, I made a decision that surprised people who knew me well. I downsized the house, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. That house had been a container for too many versions of myself: the hopeful wife, the exhausted negotiator, the woman who slept lightly, always listening for a car in the driveway. I was ready for rooms that didn't echo with old expectations. Packing was emotional in unexpected ways. Some things were easy to let go of. Others stopped me in my tracks. A chipped mug we'd argued over once because it was his favorite. A photo from a trip where I'd smiled so convincingly I almost believed it myself. I didn't rush those moments. I held the memories gently, thanked them for what they taught me, and let them go. On moving day, as the last box was loaded into the truck, I stood in the empty living room. Sunlight spilled across the floor, unbroken by furniture or shadows. I realized then that I wasn't leaving something behind. I was making space. The new place was smaller, brighter, and entirely mine. I arranged it slowly, intentionally. Nothing went anywhere by default. Every object had to earn its place. In doing so, I realized I'd started treating my life the same way. I no longer accepted emotional clutter. No vague promises, no half-shown affection, no apologies without accountability. One evening, as I unpacked a box labeled miscellaneous, I found an envelope I didn't remember packing. Inside was a letter I'd written to myself years earlier during the worst part of the divorce. I'd forgotten about it completely. My handwriting was shaky, the words raw and unfiltered. I wrote about how scared I was, how I worried I'd made a mistake, how I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. At the bottom of the page, I'd written a line that made my throat tighten when I read it now. If you ever doubt why you left, remember how small you felt trying to stay. I sat on the floor and cried then, not of sadness, but of recognition. That woman had survived something I barely remembered now. She'd held the line when it would have been easier to fold, and she deserved the life I was living now. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a small gathering at the community center. Nothing formal, just a group of women sharing stories about change. I almost declined. I never thought of myself as particularly brave or inspirational, but something nudged me forward. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't rehearse. I just told the truth.
about the apology, about the ring, about how tempting it was to believe words when actions tell a different story. I watched heads nod around the room. I saw eyes soften with recognition. Afterward, a woman pulled me aside. She said she'd been waiting for her ex to come back with an apology, that she thought it would fix the ache she still carried. "Do you think it would help?" she asked. I thought carefully before answering. "I think sometimes," I said, "we imagine apologies as keys, but not every door is meant to be reopened." She smiled sadly and thanked me. I knew she'd take the lesson in her own time. That's how it works. As months passed, I became more attuned to what peace actually feels like. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small ways. Sleeping through the night, making plans without checking anyone else's schedule, laughing without scanning the room to see if someone else is okay. And in the middle of all that, something unexpected happened. I met someone. Not in a dramatic way, no sparks flying, no instant certainty, just a conversation that felt easy, honest, unrushed. We talked about books, about work, about life. He didn't promise anything, neither did I. What struck me most was how safe it felt to be uncertain together. Not ambiguous, not evasive, just open to possibility without pressure. I didn't rush it. I didn't narrate it in my head the way I used to. I let it be what it was. And in doing so, I realized how far I'd come. The old version of me would have searched for signs, overanalyzed tone, filled in gaps. This version trusted herself enough to wait. One evening, as I unpacked a box labeled miscellaneous, I found an envelope I didn't remember packing. Inside was a letter I'd written to myself years earlier during the worst part of the divorce. I'd forgotten about it completely. My handwriting was shaky, the words raw and unfiltered. I wrote about how scared I was, how I worried I'd made a mistake, how I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. At the bottom of the page, I'd written a line that made my throat tighten when I read it now. "If you ever doubt why you left, remember how small you felt trying to stay." I sat on the floor and cried then, not of sadness, but of recognition. That woman had survived something I barely remembered now. She'd held the line when it would have been easier to fold, and she deserved the life I was living now. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a small gathering at the community center. Nothing formal, just a group of women sharing stories about change. I almost declined. I've never thought of myself as particularly brave or inspirational, but something nudged me forward. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't rehearse. I just told the truth. About the apology, about the ring, about how tempting it was to believe words when actions tell a different story. I watched heads nod around the room. I saw eyes soften with recognition. Afterward, a woman pulled me aside. She said she'd been waiting for her ex to come back with an apology, that she thought it would fix the ache she still carried. "Do you think it would help?" she asked. I thought carefully before answering. "I think sometimes," I said, "we imagine apologies as keys, but not every door is meant to be reopened." She smiled sadly and thanked me. I knew she'd take the lesson in her own time. That's how it works. As months passed, I became more attuned to what peace actually feels like. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small ways. Sleeping through the night, making plans without checking anyone else's schedule, laughing without scanning the room to see if someone else is okay. And in the middle of all that, something unexpected happened. I met someone. Not in a dramatic way, no sparks flying, no instant certainty, just a conversation that felt easy, honest, unrushed. We talked about books, about work, about life. He didn't promise anything, neither did I. What struck me most was how safe it felt to be uncertain together. Not ambiguous, not evasive, just open to possibility without pressure. I didn't rush it. I didn't narrate it in my head the way I used to. I let it be what it was. And in doing so, I realized how far I'd come. The old version of me would have searched for signs, overanalyzed tone, filled in gaps. This version trusted herself enough to wait. One evening, as I unpacked a box labeled miscellaneous, I found an envelope I didn't remember packing. Inside was a letter I'd written to myself years earlier during the worst part of the divorce. I'd forgotten about it completely. My handwriting was shaky, the words raw and unfiltered. I wrote about how scared I was, how I worried I'd made a mistake, how I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. At the bottom of the page, I'd written a line that made my throat tighten when I read it now. If you ever doubt why you left, remember how small you felt trying to stay. I sat on the floor and cried then, not of sadness, but of recognition. That woman had survived something I barely remembered now. She'd held the line when it would have been easier to fold, and she deserved the life I was living now. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a small gathering at the community center. Nothing formal, just a group of women sharing stories about change. I almost declined. I've never thought of myself as particularly brave or inspirational, but something nudged me forward.
By the time another year turned, I realized something quietly profound. My life was no longer divided into before and after my marriage. It had become a continuous story again, not a fracture. The past was no longer a place I revisited to understand myself. It was simply part of the terrain I'd already crossed. The relationship I'd begun to explore unfolded slowly, respectfully. There were no grand declarations, no rush to define anything before it had time to breathe. What surprised me most was how calm I felt inside it. No anxiety humming beneath the surface, no urge to monitor or manage. I wasn't trying to be chosen. I was simply showing up as myself and letting the truth reveal itself in real time. That calm became my new measure. Not butterflies, not intensity, peace. One evening, we sat across from each other at my small kitchen table, eating soup I'd made without worrying whether it was someone else's favorite. He asked about my past, gently, without probing. I told him what felt right to share, about the marriage, about the apology, about the ring. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix anything. He didn't minimize it or turn it into a lesson about resilience. When I finished, he just nodded and said, "That must have taken a lot of strength." No one had ever said that to me about that moment. Not "I'm sorry," not "at least you found out," just recognition. And I felt something settle deeper inside my chest, like a final puzzle piece finding its place. Later that night, after he left, I thought about how often we underestimate the power of being believed without being questioned, how often we mistake dramatic reactions for care. Sometimes the safest people are the ones who don't need to say much at all. Still, I remained watchful of myself, not suspicious, but aware. Healing had taught me the difference. I paid attention to how I felt after our conversations, energized, not drained, seen, not managed. I noticed how I didn't rehearse what I'd say next or worry about being misunderstood. That alone felt revolutionary. Around that same time, I received a message from an old acquaintance, someone who'd gone through a similar divorce years before me. She'd heard my story secondhand and wanted to talk. We met for coffee, and she told me about the apology she'd waited on for nearly a decade, how it never came,
how she'd built her life anyway. She said, "I thought I needed it, but eventually I realized the apology wouldn't have changed what happened. It just would have made him feel better." Her words echoed something I'd come to understand myself. Apologies don't always arrive when they're needed, and sometimes, when they do, they arrive too late or with conditions attached. I told her about the ring, about how it gave me clarity instead of comfort. She smiled softly and said, "Then maybe that was your apology, just not from him." That stayed with me. As spring deepened, I took a solo trip again, not because I needed distance, but because I enjoyed my own company now. I walked unfamiliar streets, sat alone in cafes, watched the world move without feeling the need to anchor myself to anyone else's pace. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the woman I'd been when my ex-husband stood in my kitchen asking for forgiveness. I could see her clearly now. She wasn't weak, she wasn't naive, she was loving, and love, when given freely, is never something to regret. The mistake wasn't loving him, the mistake was believing love alone could compensate for someone else's indecision. One evening on that trip, I wrote in a notebook I carried with me. I wrote about what I would never again accept: half-truths, emotional outsourcing, apologies that asked me to carry someone else's unresolved guilt. I also wrote about what I wanted to protect: my peace, my clarity, my right to walk away when something felt wrong, even if I couldn't fully explain it yet. When I returned home, I felt anchored in a way I never had before, not attached, anchored. The man I was seeing noticed the shift too. One evening he told me he appreciated how honest I was, even when it meant naming discomfort. He said, "It makes things easier, cleaner." That word made me smile. Clean. Not perfect, not effortless, just clean. There was no dramatic moment where I declared I was healed. Healing doesn't announce itself like that. It reveals itself in how you respond differently, in how you don't chase clarity from people who refuse to offer it, and how you trust silence when it tells you enough. I hadn't spoken to my ex-husband in a long time. I didn't wonder how he was anymore. I didn't measure my progress against his life choices. I understood now that my story didn't require his reflection to be valid. And yet, one evening, I received a message from an unknown number. Short, simple. He said he hoped I was happy, that he'd learned a lot, that he wished things had been different. I read it once. Then I deleted it. Not out of anger, out of completion. Because happiness doesn't require acknowledgement from the person who couldn't offer you honesty when it mattered most. Growth doesn't need an audience, and closure doesn't always come in the form of mutual understanding. Sometimes, closure is the quiet confidence that you did the right thing, even when it hurt. If I could distill everything this journey taught me into one truth, it would be this: clarity is kinder than comfort. Comfort can keep you stuck. Clarity sets you free. My ex-husband came back with an apology, and for a moment it almost worked. But the other ring told a story his words never could. And once I heard it, really heard it, I couldn't go back to pretending not to know. That ring didn't just reveal his divided heart. It revealed my strength, my boundaries, my worth. And from that moment on, I stopped waiting for someone else to choose me. I chose myself again and again in small, quiet ways until it wasn't a choice anymore. It was just who I was.
As summer returned again, I noticed how different it felt to live without the constant hum of self-doubt. It wasn't that my life had become flawless or free of uncertainty. It was that uncertainty no longer frightened me. I trusted myself to respond to it, to listen, to step back when something didn't feel aligned. That trust changed everything. The relationship I was in continued at its own gentle pace. There was no pressure to merge lives or rewrite futures. We learned each other slowly, honestly. Disagreements didn't feel like threats. Silence didn't feel like punishment. If something felt off, we talked about it. If we needed space, we took it without drama. I realized then how much of my previous marriage had been spent translating moods, guessing needs, anticipating disappointment before it arrived. One afternoon, while we were walking through a park, he told me something that surprised me. He said he admired how comfortable I was being alone. "It doesn't feel like you're afraid of losing me," he said. "It feels like you're choosing me." That distinction hit me deeply, because he was right. I wasn't holding on out of fear. I wasn't investing in potential. I was simply present, allowing connection to grow without gripping it too tightly. I didn't need reassurance in the way I once had. I needed honesty, and that was something I could recognize now without bargaining for it. Around the same time, I reconnected with an old friend from my early 20s. We met for lunch and spent hours reminiscing, laughing about the women we used to be. At one point, she looked at me thoughtfully and said, "You know, you always used to shrink yourself around men. You don't do that anymore." I hadn't realized how visible that change was from the outside, but hearing it confirmed something I felt internally. I no longer softened my opinions to keep the peace. I no longer over-explained my boundaries. I no longer apologized for needing clarity. That growth didn't come from empowerment slogans or dramatic turning points. It came from lived experience, from standing in my kitchen, holding proof that words can be beautiful and still be false, from walking away when staying would have meant betraying myself again. One evening, I attended a small dinner party. The conversation turned to relationships, as it often does, and someone joked about how men always come back when it's too late. Everyone laughed knowingly. I smiled too, but I didn't add anything. I realized then that my story no longer needed retelling in those moments. It wasn't a warning or a wound anymore. It was simply a truth I carried. Later that night, driving home, I thought about how much power there is in recognizing when a chapter has truly closed, not slammed shut in anger, not left ajar in hope, just closed, gently, with intention. I used to believe that closure came from mutual understanding, from conversations where both people acknowledged the same reality, but life taught me otherwise. Closure often comes from accepting that someone else's inability to choose doesn't obligate you to wait. The ring was never about another woman. It was about choice, about integrity, about whether someone could stand fully in one life without keeping a second one quietly prepared. In moments of reflection, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I hadn't reached into his coat pocket that day. If I'd simply let him leave with his apology intact, maybe I would have spent months replaying his words, wondering if he meant them. Maybe I would have questioned my decision not to let him back in. That thought alone made me grateful for the clarity I was given. Truth, when it arrives uninvited, can feel cruel, but it's often the most compassionate thing we receive. As the months passed, my life filled in around me, new routines, new friendships, a sense of continuity that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. I didn't feel hardened by my experience. If anything, I felt more open. But my openness was now paired with discernment. One quiet Sunday morning, I sat with a cup of coffee and reread the letter I'd once written to myself during the divorce. I added a few lines beneath it, years later, in steadier handwriting. I thanked that earlier version of me for her courage. I promised her I would never again mistake uncertainty for love. I sealed the letter back into the envelope and placed it in a drawer, not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence of growth. I didn't know where the relationship I was in would ultimately lead, and for the first time in my life, that didn't scare me.
because I knew this: whatever happened, I would not abandon myself to keep someone else comfortable. That knowledge was my anchor. Sometimes people ask me if I ever forgave my ex-husband. I think about that carefully before answering. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't always a dramatic release. Sometimes it's simply no longer carrying resentment as a daily companion. I don't wish him harm. I don't wish him happiness either. I wish him awareness. What he does with that is no longer my concern. The ring still exists somewhere, I assume, on another woman's hand, in a drawer, maybe replaced by something else entirely. Its fate doesn't matter. Its purpose in my life has already been fulfilled. It showed me that love without integrity is just performance, that apologies without accountability are unfinished sentences, and that being chosen once doesn't guarantee being valued again. Most importantly, it showed me that I don't need dramatic exits or perfect endings to move forward. I need honesty. From others, yes, but more than that, from myself. And I have that now.
As another season changed, I noticed how rarely I spoke about my ex-husband at all. Not because I was avoiding the topic, but because he no longer occupied space in my daily thoughts. He had become a reference point, not a presence, a lesson, not a longing. That distinction mattered more than I ever expected it to. The relationship I'd been nurturing continued with the same steady rhythm. There were challenges, of course. Two people bringing full lives together will always find edges to navigate. But what struck me most was how disagreements no longer triggered old fears. I didn't brace for abandonment. I didn't shrink into silence. I spoke. And when I spoke, I was heard. That was new. One evening, during a difficult conversation, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to soften, to retreat, to make things easier for the other person at my own expense. I paused, took a breath, and said what I actually felt, not harshly, not defensively, just honestly. The moment passed. The conversation continued. Nothing broke. Afterward, I sat alone and realized how deeply that small moment mattered, because it showed me that my growth wasn't theoretical, it was lived. It showed up when it counted. I thought back to my marriage, to all the times I'd swallowed words to preserve harmony that never truly existed, how I'd learned to interpret tension as danger, how I'd mistaken emotional volatility for passion. I didn't blame myself anymore for those misunderstandings. No one teaches you how to recognize emotional safety when you've never experienced it. But now I knew. Around that time, I received an unexpected message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, a woman who had known my ex-husband before we married. She'd somehow come across my story and felt compelled to reach out. Her message was gentle, respectful. She said she wanted to apologize for not speaking up years ago, for seeing patterns she didn't name. Her words stirred something complicated in me, not anger, not relief, just acknowledgement of a reality I'd long suspected, that what I experienced wasn't an isolated failure, it was a continuation. I wrote back, briefly, thanking her for her honesty. I didn't need details. I didn't need validation. I'd already done that work. But her message confirmed something important. The problem was never my inability to love deeply. It was his inability to love clearly. As the year moved toward its end, I found myself reflecting on the concept of choice, how often we believe love is something that happens to us rather than something we actively participate in, how often we confuse chemistry with compatibility, history with commitment. That ring symbolized none of those things. It symbolized indecision. And indecision, I learned, is a choice in itself.
One evening, sitting by my window as rain fell softly against the glass, I thought about the apology again. Not the words themselves, but the timing. He hadn't apologized when it could have changed anything. He'd apologized when it was convenient, when he needed absolution, not accountability. That realization no longer stung. It clarified. People often ask why I didn't confront him more forcefully, why I didn't demand explanations or closure. The answer is simple. I didn't need to. The truth had already been handed to me. Arguing with it would have only prolonged my own confusion. There is a quiet power in walking away without turning back. As winter approached, I decorated my small home with intention. No ornaments tied to old traditions, no echoes of a shared past, just warmth, simplicity, space to breathe. I invited friends over, cooked meals that felt nourishing, filled my home with laughter that didn't carry expectation. On one such evening, a friend raised a glass and said, half joking, to second chances. I smiled and corrected her gently, to better choices. Everyone laughed, but I meant it. Because second chances aren't always about letting someone back in. Sometimes they're about choosing yourself when you didn't before, about honoring what you've learned and refusing to unlearn it for comfort's sake. Late that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood in my kitchen and thought about that first evening all over again. The rain, the doorbell, the way I'd almost believed him, the way the truth had slipped into my hand without ceremony. I didn't regret opening the door. If anything, I was grateful I did, because it gave me something no apology ever could: certainty. And certainty is a rare gift. I don't know what the rest of my life will look like. I don't need to map it out to feel secure. I trust myself to respond to what comes with clarity and courage. I trust that I will recognize when something aligns and when it doesn't. And most of all, I trust that I will never again ignore what's placed right in front of me. The other ring didn't end my marriage. That had already happened. But it ended my doubt. And that was the final piece I needed to move forward without looking back. If there's one thing I hope someone takes from this story, it's this. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. Not the version they describe in apologies, the version they carry quietly, even when you think you aren't paying attention, because that version tells the truth. And once you see it, you are free.
As the final year of this chapter unfolded, I found myself thinking less about what I had survived and more about what I had built, not in grand, visible ways, but in the quiet architecture of my daily life. The way I woke up without dread, the way decisions felt lighter when they weren't filtered through someone else's approval, the way my body relaxed when I laughed, no longer bracing for disappointment afterward. I had once believed that healing meant reaching a point where the past no longer mattered at all. But I understand now that healing is not erasure, it's integration. The past still matters, it just no longer controls the present. The relationship I was in eventually came to a natural pause, not because of betrayal, not because of dishonesty, simply because we wanted different futures. And what surprised me most was how peacefully it ended. There were conversations, there were tears, but there was also mutual respect. No manipulation, no bargaining, no promises we couldn't keep. When we said goodbye, I felt sadness, yes, but not devastation. I didn't question my worth. I didn't replay conversations searching for hidden meanings. I trusted that something could be meaningful without being permanent. That in itself felt like a milestone. Afterward, I spent some time alone again, intentionally, not as a retreat,
but as a reaffirmation. I wanted to make sure I could still hear myself clearly without another voice in the room, and I could. During that time, I was invited to attend a small gathering where women shared personal stories of transformation. I listened as they spoke about marriages, losses, rediscoveries. And as I listened, I realized how many of us had been taught the same lesson in different disguises, that loving deeply requires sacrificing clarity, that patience is proof of virtue, that waiting is noble. I knew better now. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't dramatize my story. I spoke calmly, plainly, about an apology, about a ring, about the moment I realized I didn't need more words to understand the truth. I watched faces shift as recognition moved through the room. I knew then that my story was no longer just mine. It was a mirror. Afterward, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said she was waiting for her ex to come back, that she thought if he apologized, everything would finally make sense. I took her hands and said gently, "Sometimes the answer isn't in what they say, it's in what they're still holding on to." She nodded, and I hoped she would remember that when the moment came. Later that evening, driving home, I reflected on how many times I'd waited for clarity that never arrived because I was looking in the wrong place. I was listening to words instead of watching patterns. I was hoping instead of observing. That ring changed that forever. I no longer equated longing with love. I no longer confused effort with devotion. I no longer accepted emotional uncertainty as a phase someone needed time to outgrow. Because love that is real doesn't require decoding. As I grew older, I grew simpler, not guarded, not closed, just clear. I knew what I could offer and what I expected in return: presence, honesty, mutual choice. One quiet evening, as I sat by my window watching the lights come on across the street, I thought about how different my life would have been if I'd taken him back that day, if I'd accepted the apology and ignored the evidence. I imagined myself years later doubting again, negotiating again, shrinking again. The thought made me feel grateful in a way that surprised me. Grateful for the pain, grateful for the timing, grateful for the clarity that arrived before I repeated the same mistake under a different name. The apology was real in the way many apologies are real: emotional, earnest, insufficient. What mattered wasn't whether he meant it. What mattered was whether it aligned with his actions. It didn't, and that was enough. I don't tell this story to shame him. I tell it to honor myself, to honor the moment I stopped accepting half-truths because they were easier to hold than the full reality. I learned that when someone comes back into your life carrying unfinished business, you don't owe them resolution. You owe yourself honesty. The other ring wasn't a twist of fate or a cruel coincidence. It was information, and information, when received with courage, can change the entire direction of your life. It changed mine. I no longer wait for apologies to heal me. I no longer look to others to confirm what I already know in my body. I trust the quiet signals, the uncomfort, the hesitation, the evidence. Because the truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it rests silently in your hand, waiting for you to decide whether you're ready to see it. I was, and once I was, I never looked back.
Now, when I look back on the life I've lived since that day, it feels less like a story about heartbreak and more like a story about awakening. The apology, the ring, the realization, those weren't the ending. They were the turning point. The moment I stopped negotiating with reality and started standing firmly inside it. Years have passed now, enough time for distance to soften memory without erasing its meaning. I've grown older in ways that feel earned, not just in age, but in discernment, in self-trust, in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can survive disappointment without surrendering your integrity. I live differently now. I listen more carefully, not just to others, but to myself. I don't rush connections. I don't romanticize potential. I don't ignore inconsistencies because I'm afraid of being alone. Loneliness no longer scares me the way it once did. I've learned the difference between being alone and being abandoned. One is peaceful, the other is loud and destabilizing. I choose peace every time. Sometimes people ask me if I believe everything happens for a reason. I don't know if I believe that exactly, but I do believe that clarity arrives when we're finally ready to stop asking for comfort and start accepting truth. And that day, in my kitchen, truth arrived quietly, wrapped in velvet, asking nothing of me except honesty. I didn't become hard after that. I didn't become cynical. If anything, I became more compassionate, toward myself first, and then toward others. I understand now how easy it is to confuse love with familiarity and hope with denial. I don't judge the woman I used to be. I thank her. She loved deeply in a world that didn't always protect her. That's not a weakness. That's humanity. There are moments, rare now, when I wonder what my ex-husband tells himself about our story, whether he frames himself as misunderstood, unlucky, or simply flawed. I don't linger there. His narrative no longer intersects with mine. I don't need to be the villain or the saint in his version of events. I only need to be honest in my own. And the honest truth is this: he didn't break me. He revealed me. He revealed the part of me that knew something was wrong long before I had proof. He revealed the strength I had underestimated. He revealed how deeply I valued being chosen, and how willing I was, once upon a time, to accept being almost chosen instead. The ring changed that forever. It taught me that love doesn't live in ambiguity. It doesn't require contingency plans. It doesn't arrive with apologies that need footnotes. Love is clear. It is rooted. It shows up with empty pockets and open hands. Today, my life is full in ways that have nothing to do with relationship status. I have friendships that nourish me, work that feels meaningful, quiet mornings that belong entirely to me, laughter that isn't followed by tension, sleep that comes easily. If love finds me again, real love, I will welcome it, not desperately, not cautiously, but openly with standards that protect both my heart and my peace. And if it doesn't, I know I will still be whole. That knowledge alone is something I never had before. Sometimes I think about the woman listening to this right now, the one sitting with an apology in her hands, the one being told someone has changed, grown, learned, the one whose instincts are whispering questions she's afraid to ask. If that's you, I want you to know something I wish someone had told me sooner. You don't need to wait for proof that contradicts your intuition. But if proof arrives anyway, honor it. Don't explain it away. Don't minimize it. Don't carry it for someone else's comfort. You are not cruel for choosing clarity. You are not cold for walking away. You are not unloving for refusing to be an option. The day my ex-husband came back with an apology, I thought I was being offered closure. What I was actually being offered was a choice: stay in confusion or step into truth. The other ring made that choice undeniable. And choosing truth, even when it hurt, gave me a life that feels honest, grounded, and fully my own. That is the ending of this story. Not revenge, not reconciliation, but release.